Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons is the third expansion for the Guild Wars 2 game, and narratively will see the wrap-up and conclusion to the dragon storyline, probably the conclusion of the dragon magic and the dragon cycle. And while I'm super excited to see and play Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons, I'm also interested at the prospects and horizons that Guild Wars 2 can venture off into after the story of the dragons has concluded. So this would lead me to wonder, what would a fourth expansion for Guild Wars 2 look like? Well, I have a complete write-up, so thanks for clicking on the video. Let's go! Guild Wars 2's fourth expansion. Now, when I have created and formatted an idea for a fourth expansion for Guild Wars 2, I wanted this expansion to focus on returning to Corteria after the decade-long story of the dragons comes to a close. When closing the book on one story, there has to be a beginning to another, and what better place to begin a new journey than to return to the lands where it all started? It's always smart to remind the audience of where they once started, so returning to Corteria would be a lovely touchstone, but would also give development the opportunity to polish up and adjust some areas, giving them a fresher coat. So, what would the features in Expansion 4 be? Well, first and foremost, I gave it a little title as to hint at possible narrative directions you can go into. Fourth expansion, fan title, Guild Wars 2 Aether Storm. So, for Guild Wars 2 Aether Storm, what would be the features I'd like to see? Well, I would take a more simplified approach and focus on more quote-unquote classical types of expansion content. So, let's begin. First and foremost, gotta say, this might be the hopium or the copium, you choose, but I would love to see a new playable race, the Tengu, when returning to Corteria. So the Tengu would be in the Dominion of Winds, of course. The Dominion of Winds, you would begin the Tengu at level 60 to bypass any of the core Guild Wars 2 personal story. You'd have them leave the Dominion around level 70, and then progress to Lion's Arch for the main expansion story, where they would then level up from 70 to 80 in the expansion zones. When in the expansion zones, any Tengu would be upscaled to level 80. Tengu would have the option of leaving the Dominion of Winds to go leveling in the Corteria zones, but their personal story would be kept to their own race and expansion in the Dominion of Winds and through the narrative of Guild Wars 2 Aether Storm. This would be done so that the Tengu would not need to experience the core personal story of 2012, as chronologically at the time of the fourth expansion, adding a new race, Zaitan would have already been killed long ago, and so would Mordraboth and Balthazar and Krakatork and every other dragon. So I would love to see a new race. I think it's still a possibility. And considering certain things with End of Dragons, you know, there is always the table, and things might be on the table still. I think people in general are very much in agreement that a new playable race is something that people are interested in and would like to see, myself included. In addition to a new playable race, I would add a new class. Now, I used to not be in favor of a new class, and I used to say that because they fully fleshed out all 9 classes, 3 of each armor type, they have their core set, and I didn't really see any use for adding a new class. However, I've kind of turned a corner, so I would love to see a new class, perhaps a class known as the Oracle. This would be a cloth-based class, utility-focused, with a medium armor health pool like the Mesmer. With the fourth expansion, I would be interested to see the studio take a break from the elite specialization development. This is not to say that the system is showing all that it can provide, as I truly believe there are countless possibilities with elite specs. It just may be the case that End of Dragons elite specs have left a less than desirable taste. Instead of new elite specs with the fourth expansion, having the studio focus on and work on one specific new class could breathe a great life into the game, from the new player population all the way up to the veteran population. Additionally, with the closing of a decade-long story which takes us to brand new lands, if we ever return back to Corteria for Expansion 4, it would make sense in an expansion to not add elite specs, as the development of the core professions would not show dramatically different styles of combat that are seen in the Maguma Jungle, Alona, and Kantha. With the focus on one class, maybe we could see a very satisfying new way to play, and see a class which is fully fleshed out and polished, unlike the Revenant when it first launched. Narratively, this class would focus on leyline magic and manipulation, and originates from the Crystal Bloom and how they utilize Aurine's teachings and magics to engage in combat. I have actually fully fleshed out how I would see a new class be implemented into Guild Wars 2, and I believe after this one I will be working on that video, so if you're interested in my idea on how a new class would look, be sure to subscribe and come back later. In addition to this, the balance of the game, instead of elite specializations, I think that the professions would just see one large balance patch to fully go over all the utility skills and the traits and the weapons to make sure they're in a solid place. But because there are no new elite specs with this hypothetical expansion 4, as a trade-off, I would have it to where the missing skills for the various utility categories would be added. So this would be to the point where Elementalist signets, they would finally have an elite signet. Guardian consecrations, we'd finally have an elite consecration, etc., etc. Any of those missing categories would then be added to them. Similar to how they did it back in the day before Heart of Thorns, when they added a new healing skill. As for masteries, I would have a new Warship mastery. So with the combat mount coming with End of Dragons and the Siege Turtle, I was thinking that, the combat mount with the Siege Turtle focuses on land and has some underwater capabilities, but what about a warship that also iterates on the technology brought with the skiffs? So this would be a combat mount on water. So this would be able to deal damage. You'd have cannons. The cannons would fire at other ships, dealing damage to more structural-based systems. And I would say it would have rather low damage to enemies and players. Keyword players. But I think having a warship with 5 players would be really interesting. Instead of using it to fish, you use it to destroy structures and to do some damage to open world enemies, and even in world versus world, but we'll get there. So as for the maps, in terms of where this expansion would take place, I would say this expansion would probably be to the left of Lion's Arch, in that area that we have yet to discover. I would also say this would be a great time to go back to Claw Island and make it an actual zone. Then have the story carry on to the Dominion of Winds, the rest of the Dominion of Winds. The Tengu would be in more so of an instanced-based area in their first initial creation, but then it would be explorable to other races as well. Of course, connecting to Caledon Forest. Then later in the expansion towards the end, you go down to the Tarnished Coast, and then the remaining Fire Island chains. Now, as for the endgame and the actual content to do once the expansion is over, this also connects to the story. I think the Wizard's Tower is actually a perfect opportunity to have a scaling multi-floor strike mission system. So the Wizard's Tower would act as a hub for multiple floors of bosses, utilizing many existing boss models, and then maybe when you get to the higher floors and the more difficult strike missions, you see some newer models, some more interesting models. The Wizard's Tower, as an idea, would connect to the story of the 4th expansion. I haven't fully fleshed out any narrative structure because we have not played the End of Dragons, but Wizard's Tower is always a lovely little idea. You can do a lot of things with it. And then one month later, I would love to see a raid to then use the strike missions as a more steady transition over to raiding. And then additionally to that, I would actually really like to see a new World vs. World Borderlands map. This, for expansion 4, would be under the notion that the alliance system and the restructuring system is fully done and fleshed out and good. After that, with expansion 4, having a new World vs. World border map launch with the expansion would be really awesome to see. And I would have this be the Tropical Battlegrounds, which would be heavily inspired off of the Battle Isles and would utilize the new mastery, the warships. You'd have a lot of open water areas where players can fire their cannons at each other, damaging their structures, damaging their warships. The warships could be used to damage certain structural bases and structural areas for players to then dock on the beach and then run up and take the tower. And then last and not least, I wanted to touch on the story just a little bit. Once again, we don't have any information as to how the end of Dragons is actually going to play out. However, fan expansion wise, I think having an expansion centered around the Aether Blades would be rather interesting, and overall very TLDR as an idea. Maybe the Aether Blades return to Tyria with new weapons from the Jade constructs and the Jade technology that they kind of leached off of, or perhaps helped make. I'm not exactly sure with the story. because maybe after the End of Dragons finishes, the magic cycle is more sedentary, it's more streamlined, and it's much more balanced with Aurene, however that's going to plan out. But maybe the Aether Blades still need a source of magic, and they still are looking for sources of magic and are maybe going a little bit more power hungry. And so maybe my Trin is like, hey, the Wizard's Tower, there's a bunch of tomes there. Maybe they can point us in a direction of where to find more magics, extra bloodstones, stores of magic, rituals to siphon from the mists, etc., etc. So maybe the conflict centers around the Aether Blades returning to Tyria with new weapons to go after the Wizard's Tower and the tomes of magic and the tomes of history and secrets that are in the tower, so they can find more sources of magic to power their Aether Blade constructs and their weapons and their industry. So that's an idea. Maybe the Wizard's Tower then, you know, moves away from Tyria and starts traveling down to the Fire Island chain as the final map, and then we get to explore the very final moments of the Fire Island chain that we have yet to explore. So thank you everyone so much for coming. I've been KROOF. This is my idea of like what I would like to see in an expansion 4, mostly just a couple different features, mainly being like a new race, a new class, taking a break from the elite specialization system, adding a water-based combat mount, and then adding a new WoW vs. World map, and of course expanding upon the system of the strike missions, and even adding a raid just to kind of pair up with it a month later or something to keep people playing, of course. But thank you everyone so much for coming. These were some rough ideas on what Guild Wars 2's future could be, but once again, after the end of this story, Guild Wars 2 has the freedom to go in whichever direction they want, and to explore narrative beats or lands that we've never explored before, and I find that to be super interesting and super exciting for the future of a game that is just so much fun and so great. So once again, thank you. Subscribe, comment down below your thoughts on a couple of the topics that I might have mentioned here, or if there are any other features that you would like to see in expansions, post them down below, or you know, a story beat. What would you like to explore narratively in the 4th expansion? If you'd like to help support the channel, I have a Patreon down below to get early access to videos. And if you'd like to pre-order End of Dragons, I have links down below as well. Thank you so much, Renanette. And I will catch you all in the next video. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.